Most empires are built on land, but Venice was built on a legal loophole. While the rest of Europe was trapped in a system where wealth was tied to owning dirt, a small group of refugees in a salt marsh decided to delete the concept of a kingdom and replace it with a giant investment club. Venice was not a country. It was a massive, floating corporation designed for a single output: profit. They did not have kings. They had a board of directors. They did not have peasants. They had shareholders. By the year 1200, these islands were the richest spots on the planet because they had figured out how to turn the entire population into a venture capital fund. This is the story of the first corporate state. It was a world where you did not fight for glory. You fought for the dividend. The refugees who fled to the marshes were not looking for a new kingdom. They were looking for a way to survive in a place where no one else wanted to go. In a feudal world, land was the only source of power. If you owned the soil, you owned the people who worked it. But the Venetian lagoon had no soil. It was a collection of mudflats and salt water. This physical limitation changed their entire mental model of wealth. You could not grow wheat or raise cattle on a sandbar. You could not build a castle on a swamp. This meant the traditional feudal ladder was broken before it even started. Instead of a hierarchy based on bloodlines and land grants, they built a system based on liquid assets and trade routes. Every citizen became a cog in a machine designed to move goods from east to west. They realized that while land is finite and hard to defend, the sea is an infinite highway that belongs to whoever has the best hardware. This was not a choice made out of greed. It was a choice made out of a total lack of options. They had to be smarter because they could not be bigger. They had to be faster because they could not be stronger. By turning their back on the land, they accidentally invented the modern economy. They stopped being subjects and started being operators. This shift created a culture where the only thing that mattered was the bottom line. If a war did not pay for itself, they did not fight it. If a treaty did not open a new market, they did not sign it. The city became a living ledger where every building and every boat was an entry in a massive balance sheet. Dirt is a bad investment because dirt is heavy, stationary, and expensive to move. In the Middle Ages, moving a ton of grain 50 miles over land cost more than the grain itself. The friction of the earth was a tax on every transaction. The Venetians looked at the water and saw a zero-friction environment. They realized that a single ship could carry the cargo of 1,000 pack animals at a fraction of the cost. To make this work, they had to solve a massive engineering problem. They had to build a city where no city should exist. They drove millions of sharpened oak and larch poles into the thick mud of the lagoon. These poles did not rot because they were submerged in an oxygen-free environment. They became as hard as stone over centuries of submersion. On top of these wooden stakes, they laid layers of Istrian limestone to provide a stable base. This created a solid foundation for a city that was effectively a giant warehouse. Every house was a business. The bottom floor was for storage and loading directly from the canals. The middle floor was for accounting, management, and hosting clients. The top floor was for living. This vertical integration meant that the entire city was optimized for the movement of goods. They turned the lagoon into a protected harbor where they could control every entry and exit point. This gave them a monopoly on safety in a very dangerous world. While other cities were getting sacked by roving armies, Venice was protected by a moat of salt water. This security allowed them to keep their overhead low. They did not need massive walls or a standing army of knights to defend their borders. They invested that saved capital into their fleet instead. They focused on high-value, low-volume goods like silk, spices, and incense. These items were easy to store and had massive profit margins. They were not just moving products. They were managing a global supply chain. They established trading posts across the Mediterranean to act as refueling stations and distribution centers. This network ensured that their ships were always moving and always earning. The sea was their highway, their wall, and their bank. But as their ambitions grew, so did the size of their operations. A small boat could be funded by a family, but a massive galley was a different story. The cost of timber, labor, and defense was skyrocketing. They needed a new way to fund bigger ships. The Commenda was the world's first get-rich-together contract, and it changed the math of human ambition. Before this, if you wanted to trade, you needed to be rich enough to own a boat or brave enough to steal one. The Venetians fixed this by separating the person with the money from the person with the skills. In a standard Commenda, a wealthy investor stayed home while a young, hungry sailor took the cargo to sea. The investor provided the capital, and the sailor provided the labor and the risk. If the ship sank, the investor lost his money, but the sailor lost nothing but his time. If the ship returned, the profit split was usually 75% for the investor and 25% for the sailor. This might sound unfair, but it was a massive leap forward for social mobility. A poor man with no connections could take a small share of cargo, survive a few voyages, and eventually save enough to become an investor himself. This created a middle class that did not exist anywhere else in Europe. It also allowed for extreme risk management. A smart merchant would not put all his money on one ship. He would take small stakes in 20 different ships. This diversification meant that a single pirate attack or storm would not wipe him out. The math of the 75-25 split was calculated to account for the high running costs of medieval shipping. A single galley could cost over 5,000 ducats to build and outfit. You had to pay for seasoned oak, hundreds of yards of heavy canvas, and miles of hemp rope. You also had to pay the wages of 200 rowers and dozens of armed guards. These were not just transportation costs, they were defense costs. Every merchant ship was also a warship. The Commenda allowed the city to fund hundreds of these vessels simultaneously. It turned the entire population into a venture capital fund where everyone had skin in the game. Even widows and small-time craftsmen could invest a few coins into a voyage. This created a massive pool of liquidity that their rivals could not match. The city was not just trading goods, it was trading risk. They turned the uncertainty of the sea into a predictable financial instrument. This system relied on a high level of trust and a strict legal code. If you cheated your partners, you were blacklisted from the Rialto, which was a death sentence for your career. The law was not about morality. It was about protecting the integrity of the investment. This constant flow of capital meant the city was always ready to scale. They had the money and they had the ships, but they needed a way to build them faster than anyone else. They needed to move from artisanal craft to industrial production. They needed the world's first assembly line. The success of the Commenda created a massive demand for more hulls in the water. By the 1300s, the Venetian fleet was the largest in the world, but it faced a logistical bottleneck. Traditional shipbuilding was a slow, handcrafted process that could take months for a single vessel. If a fleet was lost in a storm, a city could be defenseless for a year. Venice solved this by inventing the Arsenal, a state-owned shipyard that functioned like a modern factory. This was a massive industrial complex that employed thousands of specialized workers. Instead of one team building one ship, they broke the process down into discrete steps. One group focused on the frame, another on the planking, and another on the rigging. They used standardized parts so that any mast or any rudder could fit any ship of the same class. This was the first time in history that mass production was applied to complex machinery. The efficiency was terrifying to their competitors. At its peak, the Arsenal could produce a fully equipped galley in a single day. They kept a massive inventory of pre-cut timber and prefabricated components. This allowed them to surge their production during times of war or market opportunity. It was the ultimate competitive advantage. While other nations were struggling to find enough skilled carpenters, Venice was churning out warships like Lego sets. This industrial output protected their trade routes and ensured their dominance. The city was no longer just a group of merchants. It was a military-industrial complex. Every ship was a standardized tool for extracting wealth from the Mediterranean. The Arsenal was the heart of the machine, but the machine needed fuel. It needed a constant supply of raw materials and a way to protect its trade secrets. They realized that their manufacturing techniques were as valuable as the goods they traded. This led to a level of corporate espionage and protectionism that the world had never seen. They began to treat their technology as a state secret, and the penalties for sharing it were lethal. This was the beginning of an information monopoly that would keep them at the top of the food chain for centuries. They had the ships, the money, and the production speed. Now, they just needed to find a way to make sure no one else could ever catch up. This led them to a small island called Murano and the birth of high-tech manufacturing. The Venetian Arsenal was the world's first true factory and a masterclass in industrial scaling. It occupied over 100 acres of the city's eastern edge and functioned as a gated industrial city. This was a state-owned enterprise designed to eliminate the inefficiencies of private shipbuilding and decentralized labor. While the rest of the world relied on small, scattered yards, Venice centralized its entire naval output. This allowed for a level of quality control and speed that was impossible for any rival power to match. By the 14th century, the facility employed 16,000 highly skilled workers, known as arsenalati. These men were not just laborers. They were a protected class of industrial specialists within the Republic. They received high wages, tax exemptions, and a guaranteed pension from the state to ensure their loyalty. In return, they were expected to be ready for mobilization at any hour of the day or night. The state even provided free wine from fountains to keep morale high and the labor flowing. This was a calculated investment in the most important asset of the Republic, specialized labor. The arsenal was a closed system that controlled every stage of production from raw timber to finished warship. The physical heart of the arsenal was a liquid conveyor belt that predated modern manufacturing by 3 centuries. When a new galley hull was launched into the water, it did not sit in a dock to be finished by a single crew. Instead, it floated through a narrow canal lined with specialized warehouses and high-output workshops. Each station along the canal was responsible for a specific, narrow stage of the outfitting process. As the ship moved slowly through the water, teams of workers reached out from windows to add standardized components. One workshop would install the rowing benches and the internal decking with mechanical precision. The next would step the masts and rig the heavy canvas sails using specialized cranes. Further down the line, a team would load the ship with hardtack, water barrels, and heavy weapons. This flow allowed the arsenal to bypass the logistical friction of moving heavy parts across a dry yard. They used the water itself as the primary logistics tool to move the product through the factory. This system turned the act of construction into a repeatable, high-speed operation that maximized daily output. Standardization was the secret sauce that made this liquid assembly line a reality. In a world where every ship was usually a unique, handcrafted object, Venice moved to a modular design philosophy. Every rudder, mast, and oar was built to a precise state-approved template in the arsenal workshops. This meant that any part from a warehouse would fit any ship in the fleet without any custom modification. This eliminated the need for expensive fitting and drastically reduced the time required for emergency repairs. If a Venetian ship lost a mast in a battle, it could pull into any colonial port and find a replacement. These parts were often prefabricated and stored in massive quantities to ensure immediate availability for the fleet. The state also managed its own forests in the foothills of the Alps to guarantee a supply of specific woods. They grew oak for the hulls and larch for the masts under strict government supervision and protection. This vertical integration ensured that the quality of the hardware never fluctuated regardless of market conditions. Venice was not just building ships. They were building a standardized naval platform for global trade dominance. The output of this industrial machine was a miracle of engineering for the medieval world. During a state visit by King Henry III of France in 1574, the Arsenalati performed a demonstration of their power. They started with a bare hull and fully equipped a galley, while the king ate his lunch in the shipyard. The ship was launched, rigged, and armed with cannons in less than 2 hours. This was a clear message to the rest of Europe about Venetian military readiness and industrial capacity. They could scale their fleet from a skeleton crew to a massive armada in a matter of days. This ability to surge production acted as a powerful deterrent against their rivals and kept the trade routes open. The arsenal kept a reserve of 100 galleys in a state of near completion at all times. This inventory was the ultimate insurance policy for their Mediterranean trade routes and long-term cash flow. This industrial capacity turned the city into a permanent maritime superpower that no kingdom could ignore. It was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of total control over the production cycle. The city was now a fully realized industrial power, ready for a hostile takeover of the competition. In 1202, the Republic of Venice faced a massive accounts receivable problem that would change the map of the world. A coalition of European crusaders had contracted the city to provide transport for 33,000 men and their equipment. The total bill for this logistics operation was set at 85,000 silver marks. This was an enormous sum that exceeded the annual revenue of most European kingdoms at the time. To meet this demand, Venice suspended all commercial trade for a full year to focus on the naval build-out. They constructed 500 ships and trained thousands of sailors to man the massive fleet. However, when the Crusaders finally arrived, they were 20,000 men short and lacked the funds to pay. They could only pull together 51,000 silver marks, leaving a massive deficit of 34,000. Doge Enrico Dandolo, acting as the city's chief executive, refused to let the Crusaders leave without full payment. He treated the unpaid bill as a defaulted loan and demanded immediate satisfaction to protect the city's balance sheet. The Crusaders were trapped on the island of Lido with no food and no way to move forward. Dandolo saw that the Crusaders were a stranded asset that could be repurposed for Venetian profit. He proposed a debt for labor swap to cover the missing 34,000 silver marks and save the investment. The Crusaders would act as a private mercenary army to eliminate Venice as regional competitors in the Adriatic. Their first target was the city of Zara, a major rival in the lucrative salt and timber trade. Zara was a Christian city, and the Pope threatened to excommunicate anyone who participated in the attack. The Venetians ignored the religious threats and focused entirely on the economics of the situation. They needed to secure their control over the Adriatic coast to protect their vital supply chains. The Crusaders sacked Zara in 1202, effectively paying off the interest on their massive debt to the Republic. But this was only the first phase of a much larger liquidation plan for the region. A new opportunity emerged when a deposed Byzantine prince asked for help in reclaiming his throne in Constantinople. He promised a payout of 200,000 silver marks and the total reunification of the church. Venice saw a chance to execute a hostile takeover of the largest market in the East. The attack on Constantinople in 1204 was not a holy war. It was a cold liquidation of a failing empire. Venice used its superior naval hardware to bridge the massive sea walls of the ancient city. Their galleys were equipped with flying bridges that allowed soldiers to storm the ramparts directly from the masts. Once the city fell, the Venetians began a systematic extraction of its accumulated wealth and gold reserves. They did not just take the portable loot like jewelry, silk, and religious relics. They stripped the very copper from the roofs and the bronze from the public squares. The 4 massive bronze horses that now sit in Venice were stolen during this corporate raid on the city. The total value of the loot was estimated at 900,000 silver marks. This was enough to pay off the Crusader debt many times over and fill the Venetian treasury for decades. But the goal was secondary to the long-term acquisition of market share and trade routes. Venice was about to dismantle the Byzantine trade monopoly and replace it with their own. The final settlement of the Fourth Crusade saw Venice claim the 3/8 share of the Byzantine Empire. They were very specific about which assets they wanted to acquire during the division of the spoils. They did not want the inland territories that were difficult to govern and expensive to defend. Instead, they took the strategic islands, the coastal ports, and the vital shipping lanes. They seized Crete, Euboea, and the key harbors along the route to the Black Sea. This gave them a total monopoly on the flow of goods between Europe and the Silk Road. They turned the remains of the Byzantine Empire into a series of Venetian franchise locations for trade. This was the ultimate vertical integration of their trade network across the Mediterranean. They now controlled the production, the transport, and the final distribution points for all Eastern luxury goods. The Mediterranean was no longer a contested space. It was a Venetian lake managed for maximum profit. This massive expansion of their footprint required a new level of security for their industrial secrets. They needed to move their most valuable manufacturing to a place where no one could steal it. They were no longer just merchants. They were the administrators of a fragmented world. Every port they took was a new node in a network designed for maximum extraction. This led them to a secret island where the world's most valuable material was produced under guard. Venice realized that selling goods was not enough. They needed to sell secrets. By the late 13th century, they had identified a high-margin product that would become the microchip of the medieval age: clear glass. At a time when the rest of the world produced cloudy, green-tinted glass, the Venetians invented Cristallo. This was the first truly transparent glass in human history. They achieved this by using a specific chemical recipe involving soda, ash from the Levant, and manganese for clarity. This was not just a craft, it was advanced chemical engineering. They guarded the proportions of these ingredients like a military secret. If you owned a Venetian mirror, you owned a piece of high technology that no other nation could replicate. The profit margins on these items were astronomical because they held a total global monopoly. They controlled the supply of the raw materials and the knowledge of the process. This ensured that the wealth of the world continued to flow into the lagoon. In 1291, the Venetian government ordered all glassmakers to move their furnaces to the island of Murano. The official reason was fire safety, as the wooden buildings of Venice were at risk from the intense heat of the glass ovens. However, the move was actually a strategic decision to create a physical firewall for their industrial secrets. Murano was an isolated island that was easy to monitor and control. By concentrating the entire industry in one spot, the state could prevent the leakage of their source code. They could watch every worker and every shipment of raw materials. This was a massive security operation disguised as an urban planning project. No one could enter or leave the island without a permit from the Council of Ten. The island became a high-security research and development facility for the Republic. This containment strategy prevented competitors from learning the chemical secrets of their success. It was the world's South's first industrial park designed for total information control. The workers on Murano lived in what was effectively a golden cage. They were granted a social status that was unheard of for mere craftsmen in the medieval world. Glass blowers were allowed to carry swords and were given immunity from certain taxes. They were even permitted to marry their daughters into the Venetian nobility, a move that blurred the lines of the rigid class system. This was a deliberate strategy to keep the talent happy and loyal to the state. However, this privilege came with a terrifying price for anyone who considered quitting. If a glassmaker tried to leave the island to set up a shop in a rival city, the state labeled them a traitor. The Council of Ten would dispatch professional assassins to find and kill the defector. They would even arrest the family members of the worker to force a return to the island. The state viewed the knowledge in a worker's head as government property. This was the most aggressive form of intellectual property protection ever seen. This monopoly on high-tech manufacturing allowed Venice to dominate the luxury market for centuries. Every palace in Europe and every mosque in the Middle East wanted Venetian glass for their windows and lamps. The city was no longer just a middleman moving spices. It was a primary producer of high-value goods. They had diversified their revenue streams to ensure that they were not dependent on a single trade route. This industrial base provided a buffer against the volatility of the spice trade. They used their profits to reinvest in the fleet and the arsenal, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of growth. The city was a machine that turned raw materials and secrets into gold. They had built a moat around their knowledge that seemed impenetrable. Every piece of glass that left the lagoon was a high-margin asset that funded the defense of the Republic. But even the best information monopoly is vulnerable to a shift in the physical reality of the world. The world's most efficient business model was about to meet its match in a radical change to the global map. The greatest business model in history was destroyed by a single ship in the Atlantic. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully navigated around the Cape of Good Hope to reach India. This was the ultimate hack of the Venetian supply chain. For centuries, Venice had controlled the bottleneck of the Mediterranean. They were the gatekeepers of the Silk Road, and everyone had to pay their toll. But the Portuguese had found a way to bypass the entire Mediterranean theater. They could now load spices directly in India and sail them to Lisbon without paying a single ducat to a Venetian merchant. The price of pepper in Lisbon dropped to a fraction of the price in Venice. The Venetian monopoly was broken overnight by a change in global logistics. They were no longer the center of the world. They were a dead end on a secondary route. This was a massive disruption that their financial models had never anticipated. The physical hardware of the Venetian fleet was suddenly obsolete. Their galleys were engineering masterpieces designed for the relatively calm, shallow waters of the Mediterranean. They relied on oars and a low center of gravity to navigate the coastal routes of the East. However, these ships were completely useless in the violent, deep water environments of the Atlantic Ocean. The Portuguese and the Spanish were building massive, high-sided carracks and caravels that could survive months at sea. Venice lacked the timber, the deep water ports, and the naval tradition to compete in this new arena. They were trapped by their own success in a smaller pond. Their entire infrastructure was optimized for a version of the world that was rapidly disappearing. They had spent centuries perfecting a system that was now physically incapable of scaling to the global level. This was the beginning of a long, slow liquidity trap for the Republic. They had the capital, but they no longer had the right tools to deploy it. This failure to adapt was a classic case of system rigidity. Venice was so good at their specific business model that they could not imagine a different way of operating. They had massive sunk costs in the arsenal and their Mediterranean trading posts. The board of directors, the Venetian Senate, refused to pivot their capital toward the Atlantic. They believed they could maintain their dominance through diplomacy and small-scale naval skirmishes. They even tried to fund a canal in Suez to reconnect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, but the technology was not ready. They were stuck with an aging fleet and a shrinking market share. As the cash flow from the spice trade dried up, the city began to eat its own capital. They shifted their focus from trade to land-based agriculture in the Italian interior. This was a retreat to the very dirt they had rejected centuries before. The investment club was slowly liquidating its assets to stay afloat. The collapse of the Venetian business model was not a sudden explosion, but a long, graceful decline. They spent their remaining gold on art, architecture, and massive parties to maintain the illusion of power. The city became a tourist destination, selling the image of its former glory to the new masters of the world. By the time Napoleon arrived to dissolve the Republic in 1797, the business was already bankrupt. The Great Council met for the last time and voted to end the Republic, effectively closing the books on a 1,000-year-old firm. But the legacy of Venice lived on in the DNA of every modern corporation. They invented the joint stock mentality, the industrial assembly line, and the concept of a state built on profit. They proved that a group of people could build an empire without land if they had enough capital and better hardware. Venice was the original blueprint for the modern world. It was a cold, efficient machine that showed us that power is not about bloodlines. It's about the bottom line. The city was never a kingdom. It was the first corporate state to achieve global scale. It remains the ultimate case study in how a business can conquer the world and how a market shift can take it all away.